This program is brought to you by Real Estimate. Know the value of your home today with a Real Estimate from realestate.com.au.
Thanks for being with us here on Business Now. Now, before we get to the latest price data of the property prices around the country, let's go just around Australia and see how the auction markets fared over the weekend. Nationally, as the spring selling season officially gets underway, there were 1,855 auctions. 2 in 3 of those properties were sold. Now, in Sydney, there were 700 auctions. The clearance rate here picked up this week, 65.3%. Melbourne, though, still on the improve, 766 auctions, and almost 73% of those were sold. In Brisbane, 58 auctions, 62% of those were successful. Adelaide had 69 auctions. It does remain strong. 75% of those were sold. And in Canberra, there were 40 auctions, 72.5% of those were successful. So let's bring in here the senior economist for REA Group, Angus Moore. Angus, the start of the month also brings the home price data from REA Group. It might be no housing boom right now, but the growth, you've got to say, does remain pretty solid.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ross. And that's exactly right. I think the way I'd characterise this year, and certainly what we saw last month was no different, was consistent if unspectacular growth. And I think the big change is that it's Sydney and Melbourne as well where we're seeing that. The story over the past few years has really been very divergent outcomes. Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide seeing really strong, double-digit growth, while Sydney and Melbourne have been languishing to some extent or even seeing prices fall towards the back half of last year. This year, we're just kind of seeing consistent growth across the country, albeit a bit slower than has been the case in Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide.
So that being the case, just dumb question for you, is that because the other states have played a bit of catch-up in terms of population that's driven the house price? Because generally you'd expect most of the population growth to go to either Melbourne or Sydney, and that's always been the cornerstone. And then there's the whole notion about, we saw the building numbers out today, they're still not kind of keeping up. So you'd think that Melbourne and Sydney would be the places where there's the genuine lack of building that's taken place.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple things that's been going on. One is over the past, really 5 years at this point, we've been seeing population flows from Sydney and Melbourne to those smaller capitals. For Brisbane, that's typically been the case. People have always moved on net to Brisbane, but it was stronger than typical over the past few years. That's starting to come back to a more typical pace. Still seeing people move there, but maybe not as quickly as what was the case during the pandemic. For Adelaide, we actually did see people moving there during the pandemic, which is unusual for Adelaide. Adelaide typically sees people on net leaving to Sydney and Melbourne. And so the fact that there was more people moving there was a big part of what was driving housing demand. And Perth is, a more difficult story. Obviously, a lot to do there with the mining cycle. Had a very weak, really decade post the mining investment boom in the sort of late thousands, early 2010s. That's starting to turn around now. And we've been seeing strong population inflows and strong price growth as a result.
OK, but it does seem as though, there was a bit of a slowdown. It was a lull more than anything else. But now, if you've got more interest rate cuts coming, and it's likely they are, then there's going to be a very, very strong period of home price growth, which sort of plays contrary to where the government wants home prices to be to make them more affordable for first home buyers.
Yeah, certainly the fact that we're seeing interest rate cuts already, we're expecting to see more, is a big part of what's been driving home prices this year. And we'd expect it to continue to do so, particularly if we see, another 2-3 cuts, which is what's expected. The countervailing factor here is the fact that affordability does remain very challenging. Even with those rate cuts, mortgage serviceability is at very, very challenging levels. And so that's going to countervail some of that boost that we'd get from home prices. But the other factor, as you say, is the fact that we're just not building a lot of homes at the moment, and certainly far below the target of 1.2 million over 5 years. And so that means, for those who are looking for homes, it is a bit competitive. There's just not as much stock as perhaps we need, and that's pushing up prices.
And so really it's Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide. They're the standouts in these numbers that you produce and have been for really the past couple of years now.
Yeah, that's right. We've been seeing really, really strong growth in those few cities over the past 5 years. To kind of underscore just how astonishing the growth has been there. In the past bit over 5 years, kind of since the start of the pandemic, prices are up more than 90% in those capitals versus about 40% in Sydney and 20% in Melbourne. So just a huge divergence in performance there. Part of that's down to the population flows we're talking about. Part of it is down to the relative affordability of those cities going into the pandemic relative to Sydney and Melbourne. That's obviously much less true today. You know, the fact that prices have nearly doubled in those cities will make them a lot less affordable than, say, Melbourne today.
I'll tell you what, always good to chat to you, Angus. Many thanks for your time.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ross.